Good stories often involve fascinating and entertaining characters. Such characters tend to go through crises that are true-to-life experiences of common people. The biblical account about Samuel, Saul, David, their descendants, and Israel's search for leadership is one of those skillful stories. Some of this narrative deals with personal issues that are prevalent occurrences for many. Other parts of it may only relate to people who hold various sorts of leadership positions in the various political, militaristic, or corporate arenas. The historians who recorded the story of the divided monarchy were inclined to relay the good and the bad of the leaders within Israel. Listen as Kathleen Farmer discusses the stories of these good and bad leaders and what they can still teach us about holding our leaders and ourselves accountable as God's people.
The end of the book of Judges describes an awful state of moral, ethical, and political anarchy in the time when the tribes of Israel were loosely gathered into tribal confederations, occasionally led by charismatic military leaders called judges. The historians who gathered together the material we now find in Judges concluded that such anarchy prevailed because in those days there was no king in Israel, and all the people did whatever they decided was right in their own eyes. The first book of Samuel describes a similar picture of religious and moral corruption, even among the religious leaders, the sons of Eli, the priests who had descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses. And in Samuel's time, the Israelites' claim to possess the land of Canaan also was seriously threatened by a massive invasion of the sea peoples, later called Philistines. Samuel was said to have been a judge who was able to keep the Philistine threat at bay by leading Israel back into a faithful relationship with the Lord. But as Samuel got older, the elders of the tribe of Israel decided that the Philistines posed a military threat too large to be handled by a volunteer army under a volunteer judge. So they asked Samuel to appoint them a king, to govern them like other nations were governed, and to lead them to military victory against their enemies. Samuel was reluctant to appoint the people a king because he saw their request as a rejection of the Lord's kingship over Israel. But eventually, a man named Saul from the tribe of Benjamin was chosen to be the first human king of Israel. Saul was a successful military leader, but the Lord was said to have rejected him for his lack of obedience to the Lord's commandments. In his place, Samuel anointed David, the youngest son of Jesse, from the tribe of Judah, to be the second king of Israel. Under David's leadership, all of the tribes of Israel were organized into one united kingdom, strong enough to repel any invaders. In order to minimize the already existing rivalries between the tribes, David and his troops captured the centrally located Jebusite city of Jerusalem and made it into the new capital of the United Kingdom. But this unification of the tribes into a single political unit lasted only a little more than 70 years. After David's death, his son Solomon made the United Kingdom into a notable power in the ancient Near East. He built the first temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. But Solomon's opulent lifestyle and his many building projects placed a heavy burden of taxes and forced labor on the people. When Solomon died and Solomon's son Rehoboam threatened to increase rather than lighten their burdens, the people of the 10 northern tribes rebelled and set up their own kingdom that they called Israel. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the Davidic line of kings, who continued to rule over the southern portion of the kingdom, which was now known as Judah. The northern tribes chose a king of their own named Jeroboam and set up sanctuaries of their own in Bethel and Dan to rival the temple of the Lord that Solomon had built in Jerusalem. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, coexisted, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as friends, for 200 years. This period of the divided monarchy is the time when most of the classical prophets were active. The prophets preached primarily to the kings of Israel and Judah, warning them that their failure to keep the terms of the covenant would inevitably lead to national disaster. The kings of Judah descended in an unbroken line of succession, giving Judah a great deal of political stability. But in the northern kingdom of Israel, different dynasties repeatedly rose and fell, contributing to Israel's instability as a nation. In 721 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the massive military power of Assyria. Judah managed to survive the Assyrian threat by becoming a vassal state, paying tribute to Assyria and putting Assyrian idols in the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. When Assyria in its own turn fell to the power of Babylon, the kings of Judah tried to regain their independence. But in 586 BCE, the Babylonians laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed the city, demolished the temple of the Lord, and forcibly moved the religious and political leaders of Judah into exile in Babylon. And it was there, in Babylon, during the period of the exile, that the priests, the prophets, the theologians, and the historians of Judah began to put their history and their traditions into the written form in which we now find them in the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And while the people in Samuel's time may have had high hopes concerning what a king could do for them, the historians who wrote from the perspective of the exile looking back realized that their kings were sometimes faithful, but more often faithless leaders of a sometimes faithful, but more often faithless people. The historians, writing from the perspective of the exile, neither idealized their kings nor attempted to glamorize the stories of their personal and political lives. In the historians' eyes, each of the kings of Israel and Judah contributed in some way to their nation's downhill slide toward destruction. Even David, who comes about as close to being an ideal king as any of the kings did in the history of Israel and Judah, even he is pictured as a man with serious flaws in his character, who makes foolish, sinful choices that will have disastrous consequences for the health of the United Kingdom. Now, we tend to remember David only as a charming, flamboyant, charismatic leader who was able to unite the tribes and lead the nation to security and prosperity. We admire him for his deeds of heroism, for his musical ability, for the covenant that God was said to have made with him. But the historians carefully remind us that David also chose to commit adultery with Bathsheba, and that he arranged for Bathsheba's husband to be killed in an attempt to avoid the consequences of his immorality. They tell us that David refused to punish his eldest son Ammon when Ammon raped his half-sister Tamar, and that he allowed his sons Absalom and Adonijah to create political havoc in the kingdom. The historian, speaking in 1 Kings, comments critically on the fact that David never disciplined his sons, nor called them to account for their actions. And Solomon, who was said to have been the wisest man alive in his time, is also said to have made some very unwise choices. The first thing the historians tell us about Solomon's reign is the story about how he murdered all of his potential rivals in order to establish his own power securely. And the last thing they tell us about Solomon has to do with his idolatry, how he worshiped the foreign gods of his many wives. Modern readers tend to think that the historians included the lavish descriptions of Solomon's glory, his wealth, his thousands of horses and chariots, as a positive part of his kingly image. But if we pay attention to what Moses says in Deuteronomy 17:14-20, we will see that the glory Solomon gathered around himself was strictly forbidden for an Israelite king. Moses tells the people that their kings must not acquire many horses at the people's expense, that they must not acquire many wives for themselves, that they must not acquire a great quantity of silver for themselves. The description of Solomon's glory in 1 Kings 10 makes it sound like the law of kingship in Deuteronomy 17 was formulated with Solomon's excesses directly in mind. And in 1 Samuel 8:10-18, Samuel's warning to the people about the negative consequences that would come from their insistence on having a king like other nations sounds like it also could have been directly based on Solomon's oppressive practices. In hindsight, the historians could see that a style of living and ruling like Solomon would lead the people to cry out, as Samuel said they would cry out, against the king that they had chosen for themselves. In most of the rest of the ancient Near East, kings were considered either superhuman or divine. In Egypt, the pharaoh was treated as an earthly manifestation of divinity, and in Babylon, kings were thought of as the special servants of the gods, who acted as intermediaries between the gods and humankind. But the historians of Judah considered their kings to be fully human, as prone to sin and as prone to make serious mistakes in judgment as we ourselves are, and as our national leaders today are. In the eyes of Israel's historians, the fact that David was the Lord's anointed did not mean that everything David did was admirable or wise or approved of by the Lord. The way in which the history of the kingship in Israel and Judah has been handed down to us presents us with a model for our own time. The historians, the priests, the prophets, and the theologians of Israel and Judah considered it an act of faith to criticize their kings. They considered it an act of faith to call their leaders to account for their errors in judgment. And so should we.